starts, to announce my appearance, which I didn't do yesterday. I'm Dr. Boaz, and I appear today for Mr. Verbeam, Your Honour and Commissioners, and I'm instructed by David Driven of Driven and Bound Lawyers.
All right. And leave's previously been granted.
Leave has been granted.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just excuse me one moment. Thank you, Your Honour. Mr. Cummings, could you please... I'm afraid, has Mr. Cummings been sworn in?
No, not yet.
My apologies,
No.
Your Honour. I'll sit back down.
Mr. Cummings, do you wish to take the oath or the affirmation?
Yes, thank you, Your Honour.
The Bible's just being passed to you now. If you could repeat after me, please. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
in this Royal Commission
in this Royal Commission
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Cummings. If you replace the Bible, please, and take a seat.
Mr. Cummings, could you please tell the Royal Commission your full name?
Robert John Cummings.
And you've prepared a statement for the Commission which is dated the 22nd of July 2015.
That is correct.
Do you have a copy of that statement in front of you?
I do.
Mr. Cummings, can I ask you to pick up the statement at paragraph 5, and if you're comfortable, just read that onto the record for us?
I shall.
Thank you.
Commissioners, my full name is Robert John Cummings, and I'm 60 years of age. I was born in Albury in 1954, and my mother died when I was born. My father quickly remarried, and my stepmother had 2 children of her own. At home and through most of my early teenage life, up to 15, I was physically abused by my father and stepmother. My father would beat me when he was angry or tired. My stepmother hit me with implements such as axe handles, stock whips, rubber straps that were hung on the back door, whenever I said or did something she did not like. Both my father and my stepmother used to lock me in my room and keep me separate from the family. I was fed separately. I was not allowed to associate with my siblings, and at times I was starved and not given any food when I was locked up. When my family went away on day trips, I was locked in my room and I was not allowed to go with them. It was never explained to me why I was kept separate. I ran away from home because of the abuse and refused to return. I slept at local sports pavilions, and one night I was picked up by the police and taken to the police station. I was taken to the children's court, where I could recall that the court found that my parents were not suitable to look after me. I have been shown a document dated 10th of July 1970 that appears to be a children's court prosecution form. This document states that I was apprehended at Wodonga at the request of my parents and did not want to return home. This document also states I had a prior history of stealing money and damaging things for no reason. I was never charged with any offences, but recall that I did do these things as a reaction to the physical abuse I suffered from my father and stepmother. To the best of my recollection, the police did not ask why I was running away from home or why I threatened to run away if I was forced back. I was taken to Turana and placed there for the hearing of a care and protection application on the 6th of August 1970. The care and protection application was made because it was believed for the hearing of a care and protection application on the 6th of August 1970. The likely to lapse into a career of vice and crime. At the time I entered Turana in July 1970, I was a timid and scared 15-year-old boy. I remember being emaciated and malnourished when I first arrived. I was taken to a section of Turana called Coolabah. This is a semi-secure section. There were other boys in Coolabah at the time, but I spent most of my time alone, and I did not share a room with any other boy during this time. Upon arrival at Turana, I was taken to the front administration desk and took a literacy test. You're right, I must point out that at that time I had very poor literacy skills and could not write at all. I was not told why I was in Turana or how long I would spend there. All I recall is a staff member saying to me words to the effect of, "You will not be going back home." My first admission to Turana was a good experience. I discovered television, which I thought was great. I was allowed to read comics, which had lovely pictures, easy to read. Play sports such as volleyball. I was not restrained like I was at home, and I was given proper food to eat. I was given a job at this time, and I did the garbage run. This was opposed to going to school. And also built the stone structure, which ultimately became the feature rockery at the Baltara Reception Centre, and is still there to this day. During this time, I was physically abused by other boys who beat me up. However, I quickly learned my place and knew how to avoid and who to avoid and how to avoid being beaten up. A few weeks after arriving in Turana, I was taken from Turana to appear before the Children's Court. The court admitted me to the care of the department as a 15-year-old on the 6th of August 1970 for living under conditions likely to lapse into a career of vice and crime. I was taken back to Turana the same day and placed in the section for children waiting for classification for long-term care. I spent a further 5 to 6 weeks in Turana doing most of the same things I'd done before, that is watch television, read comics, play sports, do chores. Towards the end of my time in Turana, a Methodist-based institution. Shortly after this meeting, I was transferred from Turana to Harrison House on the 21st of September 1970. Harrison House was operated by a house manager whose name, I believe, was BGB. He and his family lived in a separate section that was connected to the house. There were 12 other boys in Harrison House, and I shared a room with about 4 other boys. During my time at Harrison House, I was employed by Pelham Publishing in Camberwell, and my wages went to BGB. And I was only given an allowance for travel and what I needed for work. I stayed at Harrison House for approximately 6 to 7 weeks, during which I was physically and sexually abused, as set out below. When I first arrived in Harrison House, I was told to stand at the end of the corridor by Mr. BGB. When I first arrived in Harrison House, I was told to stand at the end of the corridor by Mr. BGB, and for a long time, BGB would approach me and without warning hit me in the gut with a clenched fist. I started to cry and television with other boys. The living room was a large room and had a pool table, a TV and chairs. There were boxes of clothes stored under the pool table. BGB came into the living room, turned off the TV and said words to the effect, and I stayed behind. This was the first time that BGB sexually abused me. He forced me to fondle his genitals and then forced me down on This was the first time that BGB sexually abused me. He forced me to fondle his genitals and then forced me down on my knees and told me to give him oral sex. I was scared and thought if I didn't do it, he would hurt me. So I did. I want you to check whether these clothes in the box are suitable before we pass them on. The box contained items of female clothing, including lingerie, op shops. BGB then told me to put on a padded bra, panties, slip and a satin dress. He then turned me around to face the pool table, called me a pervert and a wimp. The abuse lasted for about an hour. I did not report it because of the fear of punishment, and also because there was no one I could report to except BGB or his wife. The sexual abuse by BGB became almost a daily occurrence after this first occasion. Because of how normal it became, and because despite the abuse I was getting, I was still getting fed and I was not restrained. As I'd already been exposed to sexual abuse at Harrison House, I accepted these approaches so that I had food and or a dry place to sleep. Because of how normal it became, and because despite the abuse, after a while living on the streets, I stole items that could be sold in pawn shops, such as hand tools, jewellery, cosmetics. I was eventually caught shoplifting by the police while living on the street because of how normal it became, and because despite the abuse I was getting, I was still getting fed and I was not restrained. Because of how normal it became, and because despite the abuse I was getting, I was still getting fed and I was not restrained. Because of how normal it became, and because despite the abuse I was getting, I was still getting fed and I was not restrained. jewellery, cosmetics. I was eventually caught shoplifting by the police in early 1971 when I was 16 years old. When I was picked up by the police, I was only ever questioned about the shoplifting. Police did not ask me where I was living or why I was shoplifting. I do not remember being asked why I was not at a home. A handwritten document dated 22nd of January 1971 states that I was picked up by police and charged with 3 counts of larceny and taken to Turana. I was taken back to the remand section of Turana pending my court case. I appeared before the Children's Court charged with shoplifting and was returned to the care of the department as a 16-year-old on the 29th of January 1971. When I was taken back to Turana, I was transferred from remand to Quamby. Quamby is a secure section in Turana. The doors leading outside the section were always locked, and at night we were locked in our rooms. But in the morning the rooms were unlocked so boys in the section could do their chores. I was also assigned to do assembly line work in the basement. Quamby had about 50 or 60 odd boys placed in the section, each aged between 15 or 16 years old. There were 2 boys to a cell, which was locked at night. When I arrived at Quamby, I was taken to my cell, but I was not told what the rules were, whom I could speak to if I had any problems. I was not introduced to any officers or the superintendent. All I can recall is that there was 1 officer in charge of Quamby. There was also 1 officer on patrol at night and 3 officers during the day. Officers were known by the boys as screws. Within my first week at Quamby, I was told by a screw to line up in the corridor outside my cell during my free time. I understood later from one of the screws that all boys who absconded had to line up in the corridor as punishment. As I was standing in the corridor, other boys who weren't told to line up passed me and hit me as they walked past. The day screws saw this happening but did not stop the boys from hitting me. This happened for a number of days during the first week, and it felt like the physical abuse I'd suffer in Harrison House. There were 2 other screws there as well. The 2 screws frog marched me to Royal Park Hospital, where they took me to a doctor. I was scared. I had no idea what was happening. When I arrived at the hospital, I recalled the doctor saying words to me in the effect of, me on the streets to survive. And at no stage do I recall the doctor explaining to me that the treatment was necessary. You're here because you're homosexual and we're going to cure that with electric shock treatment. When I arrived at the hospital, I recalled the doctor saying words to me in the effect of, "You're here because you're homosexual and we're going to cure that with electric shock treatment." I have been shown a document dated 11th February 1971 being a progress report at Turana Psychiatric. Clinic. Progress Report 1 was prepared by Dr. DJ Hibbs, a psychiatric medical officer at the clinic. I believe Hibbs was the doctor that spoke to me at the hospital. The matters recorded in Progress Report 1 are untrue. After my wardship expired in about 1973-74, I returned to Turana to work as a recreation officer as a 19-year-old. I do not remember seeing any of the screws I reported to when I returned. I worked in an open section of Turana and did not return to Quamby. My role was to take out boys for recreation and show them activities that could help them in the future and for rehabilitation. I did not want any boys going through what I went through in Turana and felt like if I could show them other ways of life and provide support, that they could avoid the things that I went through. I ran a recreational-based program taking boys bushwalking. We went bushwalking on many mountains in the Victorian High Plains. I have only recently retired after 41 years as a youth worker. Impacts of the abuse. I found in my early 20s that I was an angry and violent young man. I developed a hatred for homosexuals. I was picked up for police for assault and battery a few times. However, I was never charged. I deeply regret acting out at that time. I felt that the hatred I developed for homosexuals at that time was caused by the electroshock treatment and the abuse I'd suffered up to that point in my life. I also became dependent on alcohol. In my early 20s, I was in a relationship with a girl who was a drug addict. She'd committed suicide while overdosing, and it had a strong impact on me. I stopped drinking and started to focus on changing my life. I had 2 further relationships, both failed. One was killed by a drunk driver and the other passed away from cancer. I am currently married, but I have very poor intimacy abilities. I don't enjoy having sex. It feels functional and awkward. And although my marriage is strong, my wife and I struggle with the intimacy. I was terrified to have kids of my own because I thought it was a generational and I had learned behaviour. I blocked out the abuse during most of my 20s and early 30s. When I was 35, my wife at the time and I applied to be foster parents. During this process, my ward file was retrieved by the foster care agency to assess my background. I had not given permission for this agency to access my file. I was upset that this happened, but recall that I reviewed my file as well. The documents in my file had a lot of blanks in it, and I was not provided any explanation as to why there were so many blanks in my file, and I did not pursue this further, as my own memories quickly filled the blanks. It was devastating. The documents didn't tell the truth of what actually happened to me. My wife did not know about the abuse at this time and did not know about the abuse until about 1994. I went through counselling after I read my file. I was in real denial. I sought counselling until about 2001, spent 5 or 6 years of counselling with CASA. In 2001, I stopped attending counselling sessions and started doing psychodrama to help me deal with my past. I still attend psychodrama today. In 2004, I wanted to participate in the Victoria inquiry, but I felt I couldn't because my wife wasn't aware of my past at this stage. She is aware of it now. She's a strong woman and she supports me all the way. I regret not participating in the Victoria inquiry, but I feel that the Royal Commission has provided me with an opportunity to finally speak out. In about 1992, I requested a copy of my ward files from the Department of Human Services under the Freedom of Information Act. I did not have any issues with this process. When I received a copy of my file from DHS, I noticed the documents in my file had a lot of blanks in it. I was told this was to protect the identity of others. There was no further explanation provided. I also noted the copy of my file that I received had less detail available to me than the copy I reviewed that was received by the foster care agency. In 2007, I approached the Uniting Church about my time at Harrison House. I was worried that BJB could still be in the system, but I was told he was deceased. The Uniting Church compensated me for the abuse I suffered, but asked I sign a disclosure agreement before I received any money. They offered me an apology and offered to pay for counselling, but I never used it. I have not sought compensation from the State of Victoria because of the statute of limitations. My recommendations. I hope that by providing this statement to the Royal Commission, child sexual abuse at youth centres stops. I do believe in dreaming big. I do not believe that the government is trying hard enough to stop the abuse, as it's still happening. I would like there to be better reporting mechanisms so children can be protected and feel safe that they can report abuse. I'd also like to see penalties to be increased for perpetrators and the statute of limitations to be removed. I would also like to see the people working in the welfare system be valued with decent wages and conditions and better support. I spent nearly all my adult life working in the welfare system. It was a poorly paid role, and most of the time I felt unsupported and very isolated. I had to retire due to health issues, and lack of superannuation and savings is a big issue for me. I believe that not only should I be compensated for the abuse I suffered as a child in government care, but also for the lack of value, support and care I received as a youth worker in the state of Victoria. Thank you, Your Honour.
Mr Cummings.
Mr Cummings, I've got a couple of questions for you. Firstly, in relation to some things in your statement, at paragraph 142, you talk about the Uniting Church compensating you for the abuse you suffered. In fact, that was only for the abuse you suffered in the institution they ran. Is that right?
That's correct, and the conversation was only for the costs incurred for counselling to that point. It was not a compensation for the actual abuse.
So you've never been compensated for the abuse that you suffered at Turana, have you?
Never.
And sir, in relation to your access to your records, you note at paragraph 138 that you didn't have any difficulty accessing your records. Was there a particular reason for that?
Yes, because I was actually working for the Department of Human Services at the time. So it was, yeah.
But even though you're an employee of that service and you could access your records, they were still heavily redacted. Is that right?
That is correct.
We had the opportunity to speak outside this courtroom, and you were explaining to me that when you heard a story of one of the other survivors having to use a toothbrush to scrub parts of the stairs, that brought back some memories for you?
It certainly did. That was a common degrading method of punishment. But I might further add that we actually had to buy our own toothbrushes and then use them for this purpose. But yes, at Quamby, that practice was also used of scrubbing brickwork with toothbrushes. Where
did the money come to buy the toothbrush? Were you given an allowance of some sort?
You were awarded an allowance, in a sense, at the beginning of each, I think it was fortnight, and then deductions were taken from that for bad behaviour, etc. At the end of the fortnight, you could then use that allowance to buy chocolate, cigarettes, or toiletries.
So that was a modest allowance, can we?
It was a modest allowance, and toiletries always had to be replaced first.
And do you recall Poplar House at all while you were at Turana?
Yes, again, and I heard it a number of times with previous witnesses, Poplar House was always used by the officers as a weapon. I can recall when I was being marched down to Parkville with the two officers as we passed Poplar House, to words to the effect that if I did not behave, this is where I'd be, and I would not survive.
Well, can I ask you about that now? You recall being marched down to the unit where the electric shock therapy was administered, is that right?
Much so.
Okay. Do you remember being told what that unit was for?
No.
Do you remember being marched down there on each occasion that
Yes.
you went down there? And who was it that marched you down?
Two officers.
And what were they like, to the best of your memory?
They were big and menacing.
Were they the same officers each time that took you down there?
I do not recall.
And when you say they marched you down there, can you just explain physically what was involved?
They each with one hand on each arm and held my arm as they walked me across.
How far away was it from the section where you were living?
Probably about 500 metres, I would say. I'm guessing, but I think about 500 metres.
And at no stage did you talk to either of those officers on either side about what was happening?
No, definitely not.
So would you have had the opportunity to say to those officers, look, I don't want to go?
Well, I suppose it was an opportunity to do so, but the reality is you don't do things like that. You don't speak unless you told that you can speak.
So did you think at any stage that you had a choice about whether to go to the psychiatric unit?
No choice whatsoever.
So how do you feel when you read that documentation that suggests that you voluntarily engaged in electric shock therapy?
I mean, if it wasn't so bad, it's laughable. I mean, to say that a 15-year-old is going to voluntarily go to a psychiatric hospital, put electrodes on their leg and be shocked is just ludicrous. I mean, like, I just don't know why or how he could say something like that.
Did you ever hear about other children being subject to that electric shock therapy?
No.
Were you, do you actually recall now Dr. Hibbs, who was the psychiatrist involved?
I do now. I've seen him this morning. I've noted that he's now sitting outside rather than being in court to face me.
Okay. Sorry, not Mr. Verburn, but no. Dr. Hibbs, the actual... You do have a recollection...
A vague recollection of him. Yes.
Okay, so let me clarify that. So there's a particular gentleman here at the Commission.
Yeah, I'm mixing up.
You do recognise him now that you've had an opportunity to see him?
Yes.
Okay. And there was another person who was the psychiatrist involved. Apart from the man that you recognise today, do you remember any other people who were involved?
No, I do remember that there were at least 2 doctors at some stage. There was discussion about what was happening to me. But, yeah, who they were, etc., no.
At some stage, do you think other children became aware that you were getting this electric shock therapy?
Oh, there's no question about that. Yes.
What makes you say that?
The language from the boys to me changed. I was starting, as I said in my statement, to be referred to as a bum boy. Pervert, all that sort of derogatory names was used on a continuous basis.
So you've got no doubt that they were aware that you were getting this shock therapy, supposedly because you had homosexual orientation?
Absolutely.
Can you tell the Royal Commission what impact the electric shock therapy has had on you?
I believe that my inability to connect with adults is a direct result of electric shock treatment. As I said, I've been a youth worker for 41 years. I love working with kids. Kids are honest. I could work with them. I could never trust adults. I'm literally unable to perform adequate sexual intimacy, even with my wife, who's such a lovely and sexy woman.
And
it frustrates me even today that I still can't. I can't be intimate with her. I can't. Yeah.
And you relate that directly back to the electric shock therapy?
Absolutely. Getting shocked when there are images of women's breasts being flashed on the screen has had an effect. I'm unable to.
So, Mr. Cummings, it was physically painful at the time for you as a child, is that right?
Extremely so. There were times when the burn marks on my ankles was weeping, and therefore they had to use the upper ankle.
And did you ever receive any medical treatment?
Oh no, definitely not. No.
Did you ever tell anybody back at Turana about the burn marks or any medical problems you had as a result?
No, definitely not. I mean, you don't. You tell, you get more trouble. It's just a cycle.
So physical pain at the time and significant emotional pain ongoing.
That I was still being sexually abused by other inmates of Quamby at the time.
And have you ever been compensated in any way for experiencing that?
Never.
I think you spoke to me earlier about having difficulty sleeping, is that right?
Nightmares is quite a common occurrence. I think over time I've learned to not remember dreams as such, but I still wake up in a panic with a fleeting feeling that I'm going to be, I don't know what it is, but it's... And then all I remember when I wake up in those mornings is my past.
It took you many years to be able to talk about having experienced that electric shock therapy, is that right?
It's taken a massive amount of time, and actually it's only been in the last few years I was able to talk about it. Even though it was in my file and I'd read about it, I still couldn't tell anyone.
Why do you think it took you so long?
I think part of it is shame. Shame that I allowed myself to be abused. And also shame that I didn't stand up for myself, because it was clear in the reports, absolutely clear in the reports, that I did not want this. The progress reports stated that I didn't want it, and yet they continued.
What's it been like now to talk to the Royal Commission about the electric shock therapy and the abuse you sustained?
I think because of the support of the team that made my statement, the support of all the people involved with the Commission so far has made it absolutely uplifting. It's finally, I've said my story, and I don't have a fear, but I haven't been believed.
And you saw a report last night that specifically mentioned a child who had experienced electric shock therapy. How did that make you feel that it was out in the public?
Really good. We need this information to be out in the public arena. We need the public to be aware of what the state government covers up. We need the public to be aware of how children are treated in our current system. So we, the public that elect these people, can make some changes. And we can only make changes if we have information. So I felt really good that this stuff is out there. That maybe, just maybe, if we make it so uncomfortable for governments to allow abuse to happen, that they might do something about it. Just maybe.
And you've told the Royal Commission about the support that you've had from your incredibly supportive wife, who's here.
Absolutely.
Is there any particular counselling that you received that you did find helpful?
Yes, CASA was good, but it became difficult. My daughter was also sexually assaulted and was also with a CASA worker, and it became a bit of a conflict. So CASA I had to stop. So I started, with the encouragement of my wife, to do psychodrama, and yeah, that was just an incredible process. I'm still doing it, I'm still processing, but in the process of it, of course, I became a qualified psychodramatist, so I could actually practice my psychodrama with kids.
And finally, can I ask you, you worked as a youth worker for 41 years, is that correct?
That's correct.
You first went back to Turana, is that
That's
right,
correct.
as a youth worker?
Yes.
Why did you make that decision?
To stop what happened to me happening to someone else.
Did you notice any changes when you went back and worked at Turana as a 19-year-old?
No, but I wasn't involved with the administration or the running of Turana. I was just taking 6 boys with Scotch College Scouting Movement and going bush.
Okay. And you continued your work as a youth worker for a particular reason, didn't you?
Oh, absolutely, the same reason, to stop it happening. Yeah, I want to be that person because at significant points in my life, there was someone there that made a difference for me, enabled me to make a choice, to take a different path, I suppose you could say. Get away from homosexual bashing, to get away from alcohol or whatever. Somebody was there to help me do that. I'm trying and have tried for 41 years to be that person.
And you have been that person, haven't you?
I have.
So, for example, you had yourself experienced suicide, or you tried to commit suicide that you told the Royal Commission about. You've been able to work with other children who have suicidal ideation, haven't you?
That is correct. I've also been employed by Victorian University to lecture on youth suicide to potential social work students.
So is that work as a youth worker helping those children given you a real sense of satisfaction?
Absolutely. It has been my most rewarding 41 years.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, Your Honour, might I just apply for a non-publication order over that information in relation to Mr Cummings' daughter, just so that it protects her from any...
Yes, and I will make that non-publication order.
No, not at all.
Anyone have any questions of Mr Cummings?
Your Honour, I'd like the luncheon adjournment, if possible, to consider the position with respect to Mr.
All
Verban.
right. What about you, Mr. Ivor? Are there any
I have
matters that
some
haven't...
questions. They're probably about 10 minutes in duration.
All right. So we'll take the luncheon adjournment now. So, Mr. Cummings, we're taking the lunch adjournment. We'll return at 2, and I think you've just heard those indications from 2 representatives at the bar table.
No.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emma.